welcome to the Grim Curriculum.
And more importantly, welcome to episode 100. Here we are in the flesh.
Not only that, we are recording some video content for all of the lovely folks on Patreon. Hi.
Hello, we are going to do our absolute best. We're going to improve all the time.
Yes.
This is it's not our first foray into video. We have tried, but it wasn't quite the quality we wanted to bring you guys. So here we are trying again.
Honestly, it's funny because we were just talking about this off mic. I used to be on camera all the time when I was streaming every single day, 4, 5, 6 hours a day, sometimes up to 12. And it's been over a year since I've quit that. And now I get on camera and I'm like,
who dat? Who dat, girl?
It's weird.
I think I've said it before. It took us long enough to kind of get used to our voices.
Yes.
So this is just going to be getting over that hump again, I think. But anyway, here we are, our beautiful faces for you to enjoy.
But seriously, episode 100.
Yes, episode 100. Certainly not our 100th topic.
Yes.
Because, obviously, as you guys know, sometimes our topics take up several episodes. Like this one is absolutely going to.
Yes. And also with extra credit, we have 26 episodes of that
something
now.
Like that, yeah.
But episode 100 of the main show, which I feel like is worth celebrating. So
absolutely. And also it's coincidentally lining up with our second birthday as a podcast. We're going into our third year, which is absolutely insane. Who knew?
I know.
Look at us.
I know. We're all grown up.
All grown up, big girl podcast, but getting bigger all the time. So
if you do want to see the video content, sign up on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Grim Curriculum costs you less than a double, and it supports us in a big way.
So for you homies over on Patreon, you're beautiful. And for you guys that are listening out there too, we still love you. It's all good.
And you're also beautiful.
You're also beautiful human beings. All that to say,
it's about to get really ugly for the next few weeks.
For the next few weeks. Yeah, absolutely. Dina has been researching her butt off. It's going to be crazy.
I've loved it. I've loved every minute of it. I have had a whirlwind of emotions for this topic. I have felt sad. I have felt disgusted. I felt angry and shocked. And I am just so stoked for this. I don't know how many parts it's going to be. I think it's going to be a lot. I never want to say how many because I've learned my lesson there. But it's going to be a big one.
Yes. So we have been teasing this topic for a few weeks now, and you guys have had many, many guesses as to who we're covering, but actually not one of you guessed correctly, and I'm really surprised.
Me too. This is a big one, and it's a small fella, but a giant story.
And we've covered a small fella with a giant story before, Monsieur Pee-wee Gaskins.
Oui.
We actually have a question for you later in the episode. Dina brought it up.
Yes, a legitimate question, a query, if you will.
If you will. But for our 100th episode, we are going into one of a multi-part series about the one, the only, Charles Manson.
That's right, folks. So our aim is always to try to teach our listeners something new. And this is probably one of the most well-known topics we've ever covered next to the Titanic. So our goal over the next few weeks is going to be to deep dive into the life and crimes of Charles Manson, as well as the Manson family.
Unless you've been living under a rock this entire time, you've probably heard the name Charles Manson. He was many things, including a musician, a lifelong criminal, and of course the leader of the now infamous Manson family, who were responsible for the brutal deaths of 9 people, including actress Sharon Tate and heiress Abigail Folger.
He and members of the family received a lot of media attention due to their bizarre behavior during their trials. And while some of them have passed away since, those who remain continue to garner the attention of the press and find their way into the news to this day.
Like we said, we're sure many of you are probably very familiar with this story. However, we are going to be taking the story in multiple directions, starting, of course, with his early years and his young introduction to crime.
We will absolutely be covering the start and demise of the Manson family, as well as everything in between, including the vicious murders that they committed in his name.
Speaking of the family, we're also going to touch on what they're all up to, at least the living members.
And then for our final part of the series, we are going to be diving into some bizarre territory with some very interesting conspiracy theories.
This is, and I know we've said this a few times over the history of the podcast, but this is by far our biggest series we've ever done to date. We're using countless books and documentaries for our sources, which we will be talking about as we go along. However, our first main source is going to be the book Manson in His Own Words, Destroying a Myth, The True Confessions of Charles Manson.
All of you have to read this book. It is fascinating.
It's the big one when it comes to him. Like, if you haven't really picked up any other content, read this one.
Yeah, because I mean there's obviously Helter Skelter. Everyone knows about Helter Skelter, but Manson in His Own Words, it's really a foray into his mind, which is wild. Like the way this man thought is unlike anybody else. He was a guy from a different time in a lot of ways, and you're going to see that. The book itself was written by Newell Emmons, and Newell met Charles first in 1956 and again 4 years later. Both times, Charles had been serving a sentence for auto theft. They connected again in 1979 after the crimes were committed, and the book comes from an extensive series of interviews, and it gives us a really unique view. And I want to take a moment to explain why we've chosen that as our source for part one. We're going to be talking about the early life of Manson, and we wanted to hear him directly from him in his own words regarding his upbringing. Anytime we use a source directly from the subject themselves, we have to take it with a grain of salt because some parts are obviously going to be embellished.
We will do our best to differentiate the story from the truth, but we wanted you guys to hear it from the man himself.
It's a really interesting book, like I said, and I was shocked at how legitimately sad it was to hear him talk about his childhood. He's one of those people that you really wonder about, because if he had been raised under different circumstances, would he have ever gotten involved in the things that led to his name becoming so well known?
You know, would he have become just another musician that we hear about decades later? Like, can you imagine talking to like your mom or your dad or whatever? They're like, "Oh my God, you've never heard of Manson? You gotta listen to Manson."
And I mean, he tried. He definitely tried. He has some songs. I encourage you all listen to that music.
They're
It's
available.
Weird. It's out there.
Would Charles Manson have become just your average Joe? Would he have been someone that anyone took a second look at? Like, in this alternate universe that I keep bringing up, he very well could have had a lucrative music career, but instead he had a career as a cult leader, if you can call it a career. As we do talk about later, he had so many connections with very famous and successful musicians, like some I think that are going to surprise you if you haven't already heard of them. But there is a reason we're still talking about the family today, because his actions and the actions of his very devoted followers rocked culture as we know it, and obviously not in a very positive way.
I've been looking forward to the series for weeks, and like Charlotte said, I've been knee deep in research and listen. Like, I have loved every minute of it. We're never here to glorify murder or our subjects, but Charles Manson was truly a fascinating man. And I want to preface by saying that Charles Manson was not necessarily a serial killer.
The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit classifies a serial killer as someone who is responsible for the unlawful killing of two or more victims. The key is that the murders must be committed separately, most often with a cooling off period in between. The crimes committed by the Manson family are closer attributed to what's called a spree killing.
And according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, a spree killing is killings at two or more locations with almost no time break between murders, and there is, more importantly, no cooling off period.
Typically, these crimes are planned and very calculated.
Charles Manson certainly was responsible for loss of life, but we'll get to that later. Above all, he was the leader of a group of people who would ultimately be involved in some of the most infamous crimes ever committed.
Charles Manson was sentenced to 7 counts of first-degree murder. He did not commit those 7 murders, but was responsible according to the court of law by proxy, because without his role in all of this, none of those people would have died.
These crimes also played a huge part in the end of the hippie movement, and therefore had an enormous impact on the general public.
Can you imagine doing something so heinous that it literally ends a culture?
Yeah.
Like, it was basically like, oh, those hippies are crazy, we're not doing that anymore.
Right, because at first they were peaceful, they were considered, like, a lot of people did consider them kind of a little bit of an annoyance or a menace, especially older people. But
Yes.
there was never really a point before that where they were like, "Oh, they gonna kill people."
Yeah, it was, of course, like the summer of love. And in California, it was all the free love and peace and all that stuff. And Charles Manson and his followers essentially ended that on the spot.
Absolutely.
Okay, are we ready to dive into this?
I am so ready, oh my god.
Okay, let's do it. The story of Charles Manson starts like many other troubled young boys with his mother. Ada Kathleen Maddox was born on January 11th, 1919 in Moorhead, Kentucky. Her parents, Charlie and Nancy, had 3 other children, Glenna, Eileen, and Luther.
Charlie worked for the B&O Railroad, while Nancy stayed at home to take care of their 4 children. The Maddox family was highly religious and did everything in their power to raise their children with the same Christian beliefs that they held so closely to themselves.
Kathleen, as she preferred to be called, was definitely the rebel of the family. She didn't agree with how controlling her parents were and often went out of her way to defy them.
And it wasn't hard. Her parents didn't allow long hair, makeup, and they definitely didn't want her to spend time with boys. She also spent a lot of her time with her grandmother, who was even more strict than her parents. And that is basically a really good way to guarantee your kid's going to be a rebel.
I think we all know that kid that grew up in a very strict religious household that became absolutely like wild after high school when they finally got a bit of their own freedom. So like it was still happening back then. It's still happening to this day. As Kathleen got older, she began sneaking out of the house to party with her friends. Charles would later describe his mother's young life as a never ending list of denials, which ultimately led to her running away from home at the age of 15. When it came to her partying ways, he would later say,
And before I even get to the quote, I just want to say we're going to quote him a lot.
Yes, there's a lot of direct quotes from the mouth of the man himself.
Because I want everyone to hear how he thought. Because it's not what we're used to. It's unhinged in a lot of ways, but in a lot of other ways, it's fascinating to just kind of hear what he thought about the things that were going on around him.
I'll tell you right off the bat, as I read some of these quotes beforehand, there was a part of me, for a couple of them, clearly not all of them, but for a couple of them, I'm like, I don't think you're wrong in your analysis of this situation. Like, I quite agree with you, and we'll get to it. I'll point them out.
His analysis of society, too, because he had a really unique viewpoint, and a lot of the stuff he says, it's like, wait, you're onto something.
Yeah, it just got a little too twisted at the end.
All right, so back to Mama Kathleen. He says, other writers have portrayed Mom as a teenage whore because she happened to be the mother of Charles Manson. She is downgraded. I prefer to think of her as a flower child of the 30s, 30 years ahead of the times. Her reasons for leaving home were no different than those of the kids I became involved with in the 60s. And like those kids, she chose to be homeless on the streets instead of catering to the one-sided demands of parents who view things only as they believe they should be. Someday parents will wake up. Children are not dummies. A home life is a multi-directional street, and all ways of life should be considered and understood.
So even that last sentence there, I don't disagree with him. Home life is a multi-direction street, and it very much depends on your parents to kind of guide you down the correct street, right?
Yeah, and in the right way, not forcing you down that street, but a gentle nudge.
A gentle nudge. At the age of 16, Kathleen became pregnant. She gave birth to a little boy on November 12th, 1934. November 12th is my dad's birthday.
Look at that.
The father was most likely a man named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., who was stationed nearby.
The colonel fled soon after he heard the news about Kathleen being pregnant and wasn't really seen or heard from again.
That actually makes me really upset that she was 16, and in order for him to be a colonel, that's a high rank, which means he's probably at least 30, at least. That'd be a young colonel.
Yeah, and she met him one night. She snuck off and went to this party, and it was essentially a one-night stand, which is really gross.
That's super gross. That is, if you believe most reports. In an interview that Kathleen gave in the 70s, she claimed that the colonel was involved in Charles's life until his death in 1954.
Which I don't believe. I really don't. I think she was trying to save face because, again, she was raised religious. This happened. And we hear from Kathleen a lot in some interviews, but I don't think Charles's daddy was around.
I don't think so either.
What we do know is that Kathleen took him to court and was awarded a monthly payment for him so that she could support their young son.
It was quite a while before she named the baby, who spent his first weeks of young life with the unfortunate name No Name Maddox. Eventually, he was named after her father, and thus Charles Mills Maddox came into existence.
Can we take a second and talk about baby Charles Manson? Have you seen baby Charles Manson?
So, I haven't seen baby pictures, but I will say I have seen pictures of him as a young man slash teenager, and we've all seen the sort of crazy-eyed prison pictures of Manson, and there's a big difference in those eyes from being a teenager to being an adult. There's craziness there.
There is, and he was a cute little kid. I just want to take a second because you need to see this. We're going to post this online because I've been dying to share these pictures with everyone. Baby Charles Manson, I'm showing him to Charlotte right here, right now, because I think it's honestly shocking.
Oh my god. Same black eyes though.
But then you get to this
But he's
picture.
got like a cute little smile.
He's a wee little bab. Like, I mean, it's so sad. And then you see this picture and you're like, there he is.
And knowing what he goes through, it breaks my heart. And we've said this before. Many people who have podcasts like ours where they talk about true crime, we always say it. You can feel sorry for the child. You don't have to feel sorry for the adult that made the choices.
Absolutely. He did not choose to be born to Kathleen. He did not choose to be raised the way that he was. And it all led him down a very dark path. But when you see those baby pictures, especially that first one where he's cute, he's smiling, he's got the little twist in his hair. It's like you want to hold him, you want to hug him.
It blows my mind sometimes how this adorable, innocent thing turns into such a monster.
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
Unfortunately, things were quite rough from the beginning. Charles is quoted as saying,
"Most of the stories and articles written painted me as having fangs and horns from birth." Clearly, based on the picture we've just seen, that is not true.
No.
"They say my mother was a whore, my nose was snotty from birth, and my diapers, when I had any on, were full of shit, which was often seen running down my dirty legs."
The year he was born, Kathleen began dating a man named William Eugene Manson. The two eventually married, but their whirlwind romance came to an end in 1937 due to William's drinking habits and the fact that he would often vanish for days at a time. However, Charles had his own theories about why things didn't work out. In Manson, in his own words, he said,
"Whether the divorce was his fault or Mom's, I never did know. Probably Mom's. She was always a pretty promiscuous little broad."
By this time, Kathleen had developed a heavy drinking habit herself. She would often go missing for days at a time, leaving little Charles to fend for himself. When he was lucky, she would leave him with random babysitters that she had found throughout town.
Speaking of her drinking, he tells a story of how one day she took him to a bar. She was drinking beer and had spent all of her money. A waitress was working who was desperate for a child of her own and offered to buy the baby from her.
His mother said that she would sell him for a pitcher of beer, which she did. Charles was taken away by the waitress who had intended to raise him as her own. It took days before family members were able to track him down and bring him back to her. Not that it seemed like she cared very much anyway. And this is where I find the stories of his childhood to get really sad. He had very little animosity for his mother, and he spoke about her in a high regard for the majority of his life. He wrote,
"I liked my mom, loved her, and if I could have picked her, I would have. She was perfect. In doing nothing for me, she made me do things for myself."
In 1939, Kathleen was sentenced to spend time in prison for her involvement in a robbery along with her brother.
And this was a pretty wild crime. She had been out at a bar with her brother's girlfriend when they came across a man who to them appeared like he had a lot of money.
They contacted her brother, who told them to lure him out to a gas station where he would meet them and rob the man.
As the story goes, he showed up with a glass ketchup bottle that he had filled with salt. He went behind the man and stuck the bottle in his back, claiming that it was a gun. Nice try.
In the notes for research, the amount of times I wrote yeehaw bullshit, the man quickly realized that this was not, in fact, a gun and began to argue and fight with him. This ended with the glass bottle being broken over his head and his money and car being stolen.
A 1939 issue of the Charleston Daily Mail referred to this as the ketchup bottle holdup when they reported on it shortly after.
In his book, he tells of how she was given a work assignment near death row. She would sometimes have to clean the area where they hung people. However, she was not supposed to be there when the executions were taking place.
In one of his stories, he talks about how one day they went to hang somebody but didn't realize that she was there. She was worried about getting trouble, so she hid. They hung the man and his head came off. It rolled right to where she was with still open eyes. I don't know about this personally.
This is where we kind of start to question some of the things that he says, because could this have happened? Maybe, but it's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, it's not a beheading.
No.
It is a hanging. And yes, a long drop with a short stop can do things to the human body. But do I think his head popped off and rolled away? Absolutely not.
It's this image of the head popping off and then rolling, and she's hid in a corner, and like his head's just like there, like blinking at her. That I just like, I don't buy it.
It's giving like Beetlejuice.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
It totally is.
While his mother was incarcerated, Charles went to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. He doesn't talk much about his aunt, however, his Uncle Bill was someone who would certainly shape him.
Bill was the kind of guy who was a man's man. Charles was a sensitive kid, and Bill would threaten to dress him like a girl if he acted like one. Eventually, this became more than a threat, and on Charles' first day of school, he was sent off in a dress.
He was quite obviously traumatized by this, and the other children, as would be expected, were not kind about it. He responded by fighting anyone who mistreated him that day. He called himself the fightin'est little bastard they ever saw.
And apparently all of this impressed Bill, who never dressed him in girls' clothing again.
This is just a regular, like, Johnny Cash, Boy Named Sue situation. Yeah. Oh, and as we know, it always goes well for the kid when you bully them from a young age.
Right, yeah, why don't we traumatize them into behaving? Great.
Oh my god.
Overall, he says his aunt and uncle treated him fine, other than beating him whenever he broke their rules, which honestly is pretty par for the course when it comes to the 40s. We gotta admit that.
Oh, 1930s, 1940s, corporal punishment on your kids was expected.
It was like a part of parenting. It sounds terrible, but ask anyone who was a kid during that time.
100%. As for the other children in the school, they would often tease him about his mother being in prison, and during Christmas, they teased him mercilessly and rubbed their presents in his face.
Something interesting to note is that classmates who were later interviewed would say that Charles appeared to have manipulative tendencies from a very young age. He would find classmates who were not quite as smart as he was and get them to gang up on people that he didn't like.
The majority of the people that he got to do his dirty work were actually young girls.
Which is interesting considering the Manson family would later be made up of mostly women.
Yes, absolutely. And it's curious because, as we'll talk about, he didn't do well with women in like his early 20s because of his time incarcerated. So it's interesting to me that he rizzed them up as a young kid and rizzed them up after that. But there was certainly a period in between where he did not do well with the ladies.
And he admits, he's like, I could not talk to women because all I had been around was boys.
But the ladies loved him, even from a young age.
His anger didn't help him with making friends. On one occasion, he stole some toys from another kid and burned them when he got caught.
It was around this time that Charles developed his love of music, something that would become a huge part of his life. He spent a lot of time practicing on an old piano and singing.
Kathleen was paroled in 1942. Charles referred to the day she got out as the happiest day in his life. At first, things were great. They spent a few days together, but the joy didn't last long. Charles wrote,
"For the next few days, we were inseparable. I was her son, and she was my mom, and we were both proud of each other. I loved it. I guess my mom did too. But a 20-year-old girl needs more than an 8-year-old son to complete her world."
He's not great at math, because she wasn't 20. And I realized that, I wrote this, and then I realized that because she had him when she was 16.
Yeah.
So she was in her 20s. I get what he's trying to say. But math was not his strong suit, and that's okay. It's not mine either, Charles.
Fair enough.
When she had enough of him, she left him with another uncle of his.
Mm.
You're gonna notice he had a large amount of said uncles. This one in particular had 4 daughters, and he was reasonably nice to him, with one major event being the exception.
One day, he found little Charles being mean to his dog. He took him out back and beat him mercilessly. Afterwards, he told him to never be mean to animals.
Kathleen would be in his life in an on again, off again basis, often leaving him with family members of other men she referred to as his uncles. He eventually realized these men weren't related to him, but were friends or friends of the family. Basically, just anyone who was willing to take him in.
He also came to realize that his mother was open to having relationships with both men and women. In his book, he talks about liking when she was with women more because it was nicer to have a woman around than a man.
Speaking of the book, he tells of another occasion where his mother woke him up from a dead sleep and told him that they had to leave immediately because she had gotten into a bar fight and broke a bottle over a man's head. And they left town soon after. And like I said, this is some yeehaw level drama.
And having grown up in a yeehaw town, I can confirm this is yeehaw level drama.
He talks about his mother's promiscuity a lot in the book, and he gets into some really gross details. Just a warning if you do end up reading it. During one of the many times he addresses rumors of her being a sex worker, he says,
"Knowing the things I know now, I wish my mother had been smart enough to start out as a prostitute. You can sit back and say a statement like that is about what is expected out of Manson's mouth, but to me, a class whore is about as honest a person as there is on earth. She has a commodity that is hers alone. She asks a price for it, and if the price is agreeable, the customer is happy, the girl has her rent and grocery money." Again,
Not
agree
wrong.
Yeah,
You're
I
not
agree
wrong.
with him. To me, as long as it's done properly, there's nothing wrong with sex work.
Right? As long as everyone is safe and it's all done above board and everything is good, why the hell not? Do your thing.
I think that's a very, I mean, obviously he had a lot of time on his hands to have these sort of philosophical thoughts, but I think that's remarkably perceptive for someone that didn't have a great education and
Yeah.
had an upbringing as rough as he did. You would think, if anything, his thoughts on the matter would be the opposite. You would think that he would hate his mother, but he didn't.
He really didn't, and we'll get to it later how his feelings towards her change. But one of the interesting things about him is you just talked about him being really perceptive. And when you watch Manson interviews, there's 2 Mansons. There is perceptive Manson where he says this stuff and you're like, yeah, okay. And then there's like unhinged, almost jumping up on the table, screaming at Diane Sawyer, Charles Manson.
Absolutely. It probably won't surprise anyone to know that Charles began getting into trouble at a very young age. In an interview with Diane Sawyer, he states that he set fire to his school out of sheer boredom.
By the age of 12, Charles had moved around to more places than he could count. Needless to say, his level of education left something to be desired.
He was mature enough to realize that he was, in his own words, cramping her style. Multiple men in Kathleen's life would say that they really liked her, but they couldn't handle her, quote unquote, sneaky kid.
One day after a particularly bad breakup, Kathleen took Charles to the courthouse and told the judges that she couldn't afford to raise him anymore. Okay, so off mic, we just had a discussion about this. My pronunciation. I'm going to stick with Charlotte. She has an idea of what it is. I think I agree. So anyways, the judge made him a ward of the state, and he was taken to the Gabot School for Boys in Indiana.
Now, we've talked about this kind of boys' schools before, and most of them...
This was not a happy place.
Not a happy place. Gabot is actually still around. It was originally founded in 1921.
Is it Gabot or Jabot? I just said Jabot.
I think you said Gabot. Did you not?
Did I?
Gabot is actually still around. It was originally founded in 1921 by the Indiana Knights of Columbus. It was housed to hold 25 boys. By the time Charles arrived, it had been expanded and could accommodate a total of 54.
They still have a website online, and it's so like positive and like, we will help you and stuff like that. And I'm like,
I know a long time has gone by.
Right? I still don't trust it though.
No.
It was run by priests and religious staff who had no qualms with corporal punishment for even the smallest infraction. This was usually in the form of beatings with either a paddle or a leather strap.
Their Wikipedia page actually boasts Charles Manson as a notable former student, along with William Hirons, who grew up to be known as the Lipstick Killer.
Which, by the way, we've added him to our list because yikes.
I hadn't heard of William Hirons or Herons, but I have heard of the Lipstick Killer, so we're definitely gonna have to look into him.
I did a quick Google search because I was like, lipstick killer, who's this guy? Because I was like, did he put the lipstick on? Like, what did he do?
Yeah.
And he wrote these like horrifying messages in lipstick on the walls after he killed people. And
he's
I'm
just like a regular Ramirez.
right?
Here.
Yeah, and so he's on the list.
Right on. So nowadays, the school is called the Gibbolt Children's Services. Their website states the following.
Gibbo utilizes a trauma-informed approach based on the understanding that previous traumatic experiences affect the way a person thinks, feels, behaves, and responds to treatment. Gibbo has adopted a stages of change model, which is a collaborative approach where children are encouraged to take a leadership role in their own treatment by identifying those issues they want to change and taking ownership of their treatment process.
But unfortunately for Charles, it would be a very long time after his stay that they would abandon the beat the shit out of them until they listen approach. He would later say that this was a huge turning point for him in his young life. He had felt abandonment from his mother before, but this was on a whole other level. About this, he said,
By the time I was escorted to the dormitory I would live in for the next 10 months, I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. Tears ran down my cheeks. My legs were so rubbery I could hardly walk. Some invisible force was crushing my chest and stealing my life away from me. I loved my mother. I wanted her. Why, Mom? Why is it this way? I was lonely, lonelier than I had ever been in my life. I haven't felt that lonely since.
He was only 12 years old.
Take a second and think about that. What were you doing at the age of 12? I was playing Neopets and RuneScape while listening to a lot of Good Charlotte.
I was also playing Neopets. I was crushing a book a day, trying desperately with all my power to be a horse girl. It failed because I'm fucking lazy and horses are a lot of work. And I was also listening to Good Charlotte, so there you have it.
You were doing that while trying to be a Good Charlotte.
Can you imagine? Okay, look at me. You've seen me on social media. If you haven't, feel free to check me out. Ominous Walrus. Braces, glasses, flat-chested, wanted so bad to be a horse girl, but also wanted so bad to be emo.
Oh, I remember being younger and meeting these like older goth girls and I was like, I want to be you. And in grade 7 for class pictures, I did the Benji Madden eyeliner. And the worst part is I did it with a girl who was like, we're going to do this together. And she did mine first. And then time ran out and she didn't do hers. And I still hate her for that, Victoria. If you're listening.
Victoria?
You bitch.
You might have changed, but you were not a girl's girl in that
No,
moment.
you weren't.
We do not like.
No. And say, okay, by this point, Charles was by far one of the smallest boys at the school. Due to this, it was very likely that he was sexually abused while he was there. In some of his reports, he says that he only ever saw things happen but was never victimized himself. Other times, he talks about horrific things being done to him.
In later reports, there were claims made by Charles that he sexually assaulted at least one other boy while holding a piece of broken glass to the child's throat.
At first, he was bullied relentlessly for showing emotion. Eventually, he learned to hide his feelings. Children were encouraged to report each other for misdeeds, and it was at this time that he learned, and this is a direct quote, friends could be cruel and enemies dangerous.
Kathleen would visit her son on occasion. Each time he was so excited to see her. She would talk to him about what she was up to in life and the things that she was doing so that she could provide him a stable home.
Each time she visited, she would tell him that it was only a matter of time before he could leave the school and the two would have a wonderful life together.
But it didn't take long until the visits became less and less frequent. But each time she would say the two words that he began to dread, pretty soon.
Charles waited and waited, but eventually he realized that pretty soon didn't mean much coming from Kathleen. He decided to take matters into his own hands.
He chose to run away from the school and make his way to where his mother was staying. In his young mind, he believed that this would show her that he was grown up and capable of more than she thought. He thought that she would be eager to have him back, and he wanted to help her pay the bills. Not with a legitimate job, of course. I mean, he's 12 at this point, but by stealing.
This could not have gone less according to plan. Upon seeing him, Kathleen was both shocked and disappointed. She returned him to the school the following day. This devastated Charles, who wrote,
I didn't feel like a boy any longer. There were no tears, at least none that ran down my cheeks. I didn't feel weak or sick, but I also knew I could no longer smile or be happy. I was bitter and I knew real hate.
It wasn't long before he ran away again. This time he knew it was up to him to take care of himself.
Charles made his way to Indianapolis. At first, he spent his nights sleeping in old sheds that he broke into, as well as alleyways. He committed petty theft here and there, usually stealing food and small amounts of money.
One night, Charles decided to break into a small grocery store because he was hungry. To his surprise, he found a cigar box on the counter containing around $100. He would later say at this point, this was the most money he had ever seen in his life.
This was a big break for him. He took the money and ran. Later, he bought himself some new clothes and enough food to feed him for a few days. After this, he continued to steal as well as work odd jobs in order to support himself.
Eventually, he was able to get enough money together to rent a room.
Overall, things were going relatively great for him. He was living a carefree and honestly careless, unsupervised life, but it was probably the closest thing he'd had to stability in years.
At one point, he even had a legitimate job doing deliveries for Western Union, but the money he was earning wasn't enough, so he continued to commit crimes for extra cash.
This all came to a screeching halt one day when he stole a bike. Officers found out who he was and showed up where he was staying. They expected to meet with his parents and have a talk about their troublesome child. However, they were pretty shocked when they saw a preteen living on his own. He was then arrested.
My question is, who the hell was renting this room to him? That was just like, yeah, sure, okay.
And police officers looking at a preteen boy living on his own, clearly stealing to survive, were like, let's arrest him.
Yeah.
I feel like there was a better solution here.
This is one of those stories where there were a lot of chances and a lot of things that could have happened that would have just stopped all of this.
Well, even when his mom sold him for a pitcher of beer to a waitress that really wanted a child, I often wonder, what if he'd have just stayed with her?
Yeah.
And she'd have just kind of, unofficially adopted it. He might have had a wonderful life with someone in a mother position that loved him and wanted him to thrive.
Because keep in mind, like, the era in which this happened, I'm not saying that kind of thing happened all the time, but there were a lot of cases where people would just like be like, oh, you can raise my kid, I can't. There you go.
Well, and in the 30s, when either you're in the middle of the Great Depression or recovering from the Great Depression shortly after, people were literally selling their kids because they knew someone else could give them a better life. Or, like we said last episode, actually, they literally couldn't feed their kids.
Yeah.
So someone else needed to.
Exactly.
The police officers that found him did call his mom, and he was set to appear in court. Kathleen went with him, but stressed to the judge that she was still not capable to raise her son on her own. The judge, who felt bad for Charles, sent him to a place called Father Flanagan's Boys' Town, which was a school for troubled young boys in Omaha.
Father Flanagan's Boys' Town. That, I don't like it.
Oh, that gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Right? Oh. So Boys' Town is now well known for their work with youth, and it probably wouldn't shock you all to know that they rarely talk about the fact that Charles was a former student of theirs.
Which is quite the 180 compared to the first school he ended up in. Charles would later say that his lack of reform at the school was through no fault of their own. He didn't really stay there long enough to be impacted by them in any way.
4 days after he arrived, he and another boy escaped. They stole a car that they eventually crashed. Neither of them were hurt, but the two of them performed a string of robberies before making their way to Indianapolis, where the other boy's uncle lived.
This uncle was not exactly a great role model. He saw their ability and willingness to commit crimes, and the three became a team. Charles would later say that it didn't seem fair because him and the other boy would do all of the work, while this uncle pocketed the majority of the money that they stole.
He was eventually caught and sent to the Indianapolis City Juvenile Hall. In Manson, in his own words, Charles talks about an incident that happened on his first day there. A maintenance man was doing some work and turned his back on his toolbox. Charles saw this as an opportunity and stole a pair of wire cutters. And I know this is all really serious and it's terrible, but it blows my mind how completely unhinged he was. Like, you can't turn your back on this kid.
Absolutely not. I think of myself like if I stole a car and crashed it, my parents would fucking kill me. Not to mention like stealing something immediately at your new school.
He had no one that cared about him.
No.
This is all that he knew. It was, I survive by taking what I need to take, and I want to get the fuck out of here. Here's some wire cutters. I will use them later.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of being completely unhinged, that night, Charles, along with around 30 other boys, escaped. They got out using the cutties. They got out using the wire cutters that he had stolen and took off. Some of them were able to evade capture for a few days, but Charles was caught shortly after.
He had stolen a car and he was caught. He would later say that he remembered hardly being able to see over the steering wheel because he was so small. And if this wasn't so heartbreaking, it would be adorable.
It comes off as almost comical at a surface level.
Yes.
It sounds all very like, oh, boy is escaping the school with wire cutters. But then obviously based on what we've already talked about, it's like, no, they're escaping because they're scared of being hurt and beat and being lonely and tortured, basically. After this particular string of crimes, he was sentenced to yet again another reform school called the Indiana School for Boys in Plainsfield.
In the book, he tends to paint a lot of things in an overall optimistic light. He downplays a lot of his trauma and the things that happened to him, likely because to him, it was normal. But he does not speak about this place in a positive light, not in the least.
He states that even years later, he hopes that all of the warped, sadistic bastards he met there are all now dead and gone, and for good reason.
With that being said, we do want to warn you guys, we're going to be discussing some pretty serious sexual assault here in a moment.
In typical Charles fashion, he escaped during his intake and made it a whole 15 minutes before he was caught again. By this point, he clearly had a reputation as a troublemaker, and those responsible for keeping an eye on him were determined to change that. Charles says that he was told,
Manson, we've been told you're a tough little bastard, and I'm here to tell you, your ass is going to be full of scars before you leave here.
He added,
It was. In fact, it still is.
During the Diane Sawyer interview, Charles talks about other students being encouraged by staff to sexually assault him. He was also beaten regularly. He recounts multiple times where a staff member had other students hold him down while he was punished, and talks about how he later understood that they did it out of fear for being beaten themselves.
He attempted to run away from the school countless times, but was always caught. He developed a method of self-defense that he dubbed the insane game. He would act completely wild when someone came at him in the form of making faces, flailing his arms around, and shrieking as loud as he could. Unfortunately, it did not always work, and the abuse continued.
About his size, he wrote,
If I stretch to my fullest height and cheat a little by slightly lifting my heels from the floor, I can achieve a height of 5'5". I think at one time I weighed a healthy 140 pounds, but a time or two during my confinement I have dropped as low as 115. A bulky, bruising hulk I am not, but my voice can be as big and loud as the largest of men. And super inappropriate question, but I was pondering.
Yes, this was the question we mentioned in the beginning.
Who do you think would win in a fight, Charles Manson or Pee Wee Gaskins?
So I gave this quite a bit of thought during my lunch hour today.
Good.
I think it would be Pee Wee.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, because I think, as we've said, they had very similar upbringings,
yes,
right? Like a family that didn't want them, sold off to people for like frivolous shit, boys' school, abuse, all that stuff. I just think Pee Wee has a little extra crazy in him.
You do.
Yeah,
right? See, I'm of the opposite thought, and I want to know what you guys think. thegrimcurriculum@gmail.com. Let us know. I think Charles is the kind of guy Pee Wee wanted to be. And I think about Pee Wee. I was thinking about when he slit the guy's throat while the guy was on the toilet taking a shit.
Yes.
And he was the kind of guy who would do stuff like that. Whereas Charles was, I think he was next level. I really do. So let us know what you think, because clearly we don't agree with each other here.
I don't know, but yeah, you guys, let us know what you think. What do you think, Pee Wee or Charles? I think in a full out, in a cage match.
Cage match.
I'm thinking Pee Wee.
I would pay a lot of money to see that fight.
One day.
I've watched some UFC recently. Apparently, I'm into UFC. This is something I've just learned about myself, and I would pay money for that match.
Honestly, maybe this is a real hot take, and if it's offensive, I'm so sorry. I honestly think that's maybe what we should do with some of the worst people out there. Have
Fuck
them
yeah.
fight
Oh
it
my
out,
God. Are you
fight it
kidding
out to
me?
the death.
I want to see like Chris Watts versus
Oh.
Scott Peterson. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
let them go at each other. Death match. Bring it back. Gladiator style. I would love to see it.
I'm here.
Ruby Frankie versus Jody Hildebrandt. Let's go.
There would be some hair pulling and scratching. in that
Yes,
one.
I am so down.
Oh my god. But yeah, let us know. Back to Charlie Boy. During this particular time, he was assigned to work at the dairy on site. He states that he'd often be pushing a wheelbarrow full of shit up a steep ramp while the welts in his behind seeped. If he didn't move fast enough, he would be beaten further.
He also talks about another time where 4 larger boys cornered him in a barn. They attempted to sexually assault him, but they were stopped by a staff member in time. Rather than consoling him, the staff member punished him for crying, and he said to him, "Now you boys know you're not allowed to wrestle."
Oh, it's a bit more than wrestling, my
Ugh.
guy. The man in charge of the dairy, Mr. Fields, sounds innocent, not fucking innocent.
No.
He was particularly sadistic towards Charles and would not only fail to protect him from the other boys, but would actively encourage them to torture him. He'd be humiliated in front of them, often being forced to pull his pants down and prove that he wasn't being assaulted.
One day, Charles managed to get some revenge. He beat one of the assailants with an iron crank he found while the kid was asleep until he saw the boy was unconscious, and then he planted the crank in the bed of another boy who had assaulted him. In Manson, in his own words, he says,
All of us were questioned. No one was charged with the assault, although the other rapist was the prime suspect. When his partner returned from the hospital, the two of them didn't have much to do with each other. It was whispered that I had done the clubbing, and no matter how small I was, no one else at Plainfield tried to put his dick in my ass.
During all of this, he continued to try to run away. He claims this was not because he was trying to rebel, but because he was tired of being constantly abused by the staff and other inmates. It was during this time that he felt more alone than ever. Unlike the other boys, he had no visitors and he didn't get mail from anyone. He says,
I was just there and nobody gave a fuck. The fear of getting caught wasn't any worse than the fear of what the next breath might bring, so my head was always looking towards the road every minute.
Each time he was caught, he was beaten further. All in all, he spent 3 years at the Indiana School for Boys. He would later say that the only good thing he could say about the place was that it had an impressive front lawn. By the time he was 16, he had this to say.
At an age when most kids are going to nice schools, living with their parents, and learning about all the better things in life, I was cleaning silage and tobacco juice out of my ass, recuperating from the wounds of a leather strap, and learning to hate the world and everyone in it. I wonder if any of these abusers from the schools were still around when Charles rose to infamy. What crossed their minds when they saw him on the news?
Yeah.
Do you think any of them saw him and felt any remorse or guilt for what they had created? I honestly don't think they probably did. They probably thought like, oh, shithead, we knew he'd end up here.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't get me wrong. Charles Manson made his fucking choices. But make no mistake, those monsters, both adult and child at those fucking institutions, they played a major part in breaking a person who had already experienced nothing but trauma.
And I hate to say it, but like the other kids, you almost expect that that's going to be something that happens, unfortunately, because these are all hurt children to begin with, and they're going to take it out on each other. But the fact that the staff were just as complicit in this abuse as the children were, and they encouraged it and they abused him themselves, it's disgusting.
It is. It's absolutely horrendous. And to be fair, they all belong in jail too.
They do.
So Charles had two options when it came to being released. One would be to climb up the ranks of a merit system that the school had. This was something that Charles did not think he would ever be capable of. And my thought is, even if he had tried to put the effort in, based on what we know about the adults that worked in these institutions, would it have even made a difference?
Right.
I think even if he had good intentions and tried to be good and play by their rules, I think they already had it out for him.
Yeah.
I don't think it would have helped anyway.
The other option for him to get out would be for a court order to be filed by his mother, something Kathleen had no interest in doing. So once again, he ran. This time, he was able to evade capture for up to 2 weeks.
Charles and two other boys took off and stole a car. They wanted to make their way to California, but made it as far as Utah before they were arrested and sentenced to spend time at a federal reformatory called the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C.
By this point, Charles had 5 years of incarceration under his belt. He knew how he had to behave in order to survive. He was smaller than most, but had the personality and guile to keep himself safe, or at least as safe as possible.
He spent a lot of his time hanging out with people who had enjoyed their fair share of luxuries on the outside. Charles would often listen to their stories about partying and dating girls, two things he had yet to enjoy.
On the inside, he knew that he couldn't relate to any of their stories. They'd often read him letters from their girlfriends or parents, while Charles knew that even his own mother didn't want him.
On the outside, he acted and portrayed a arrogant demeanor that led those around him to believe that he was confident and prideful.
He talks a lot about his sexual experiences with other boys during this part of the book, like a lot. Charles Manson, he did not believe in TMI, not one bit. But one of the things that he mentions that I found interesting is that while he had many encounters with his fellow inmates, he never considered himself gay. He just said that he didn't have girls around, so he enjoyed what he could.
Charles Manson was finally paroled at the ripe old age of 19. This was his first time being legitimately free since the age of 12.
He essentially missed out on every childhood experience one could have along with his teenage years.
The rules of his parole stated that he was to go live with the same aunt and uncle who had raised him while his mother was in prison.
During this time, he was very happy. He enjoyed the freedom of being able to do things as simple as eat whatever he wanted. Charles spent a lot of his free time going for walks and enjoying the outdoors.
It didn't take long until he realized that he had an incredibly hard time relating to other people. Something as simple as a pleasant conversation was completely foreign to him. He had nothing in common with those around him, especially people his own age.
He also had a very difficult time finding work. It was impossible for him to talk about his employment history without admitting to his criminal past, which made most people not want to hire him. So he took on jobs that no one wanted.
If any of that seemed particularly hard, it was really nothing compared to the difficulty he had communicating with young women that he met at this time. About this, he said,
When it came to girls, my heart throbbed and I ached with desire, but I couldn't think of the proper things to say. I didn't know the first thing about finesse, so I'd revert to some of the bullshit I'd heard laid down by some of the older guys in reform school. It didn't work for me. In most cases, that kind of conversation sent the girls packing instead of impressing them.
keep in mind, he has not been around a girl from the age of 12 to 19.
Which is some pretty formative years where you're realizing, like, hey, I like ladies, if that's your vibe.
Yeah, and he didn't even get the chance to figure that out.
He goes on to say that the young lady that he would finally lose his virginity to would end up being his first wife. Her name was Rosalie Jean Willis, and she was only 15 when she met him, and at this point, Charles was 20.
Yikes. Rosalie was originally from Benwood, West Virginia. Her father worked as a coal miner and brought her along with him to a poker game one night. Charles was there and winning big. He noticed her right away and talked to her while her father was distracted with his own game.
The way he paints this made me kind of laugh, and I was going to add it in the script, but I kind of thought about it. So, in his version of the story, he's at this poker game and he is winning and winning and winning and he's doing awesome, and then he finishes and he's like, all of these other ladies were like looking at me and they're like looking at me, they're flirting with me, they want my attention because they see I have all this money, but I saw her and she was the one who wasn't giving me attention. She was a nice girl, she wasn't fake like them, and I wanted her. And I just don't picture him like winning mad cash and being like fawned over by all these ladies, because I just don't think that happened.
Also, probably the reason she wasn't fawning over you, sir, is because she's fucking 15.
Yes.
And you're a grown-ass man at this point.
She's like at a poker game that her dad dragged her to.
Which is also weird. Like, bad move, Dad.
Right?
I don't like that either. The two chatted, and she told him that she was working as a waitress. He visited her at work a few times, and eventually they went on a few dates. It didn't take long before Charlie says that they were in love.
For a short time, his life was normal, something he had never experienced before. He had a steady and legitimate job, and he enjoyed working during the day and coming home to her. But it didn't take long before the demands of life got to him.
The two were still both quite young and not very financially literate, so eventually the money ran out and tensions became high. Soon enough, he was back to committing crimes, something Rosalie was somewhat familiar with herself.
Eventually, he got into some trouble due to a botched car theft, and the couple relocated to California. The two packed all of their possessions into a stolen vehicle and made their way to their new home.
By this time, Rosalie was pregnant, and the stresses of life were present more than ever for the young couple. However, the two continued to live a fairly simple and happy life. But one day, Charles was busted for still driving the vehicle he had stolen to get them there. And because he had taken it across state lines, the FBI became involved.
Due to the upcoming birth of their child, a judge sentenced him to 5 years probation rather than giving him more jail time. But Charles had another charge in Florida that he had to answer to. Instead of dealing with that, he went on the run as a fugitive, something that very obviously deeply hurt Rosalie.
While he was on the run, Rosalie stayed with Kathleen, who Charles had maintained a relationship with. Eventually, he was arrested in Indianapolis and sent to serve at Terminal Island.
He writes that during this time, things weren't too bad. The guards were there for a paycheck and had no desire to torture the inmates. He was no longer serving time with boys, but with men. His intention was no longer to escape, but to behave, serve his time, and get back to his wife.
How shitty is that? And there's a lot of controversy around various prison systems around the world.
Hmm.
But how fucking bad is it when real adult prison is a cakewalk in comparison to the boys' schools he went to?
Yeah, and he was serving time with real criminals like murderers and sex offenders and all sorts of people. And he says, like, they were more interested in just doing their time, getting out of there, instead of absolutely torturing one another.
Wild. His first few months there were filled with visits from Rosalie, which led him to having a positive attitude and staying out of trouble. However, like the visits with his mother when he was younger, they became less and less frequent until one day they stopped altogether.
Charles was devastated when one day Kathleen came to visit with some news. Rosalie had moved out and she was living with a truck driver she had met. She took their baby with her.
This led to him no longer caring about what he called going straight, and before long, Charles was back to his old self. He escaped and was caught in the parking lot trying to hotwire a car.
He was sentenced to an additional 5 years of probation that was set to start after his initial 5 years were done. About this time in his life, Charles wrote,
Even if she had stuck by me and had been waiting when I got out of Terminal Island, I don't know what the results would have been because it's obvious there is something lacking in my makeup. It could have started with being a bastard son in my life with and without my mother. Maybe it was the years at Plainfield, or maybe the insanity of my Uncle Jess and grandfather. I do know that until my wife left me, I was filled with honest thoughts for our future together. I also know that the letdown I experienced when I realized I had lost her was a turning point in my life. I figured, screw all that honest John bullshit. I'm a thief. I don't know anything else. I made up my mind to perfect myself in the life I had been leaning towards since I stole all those toys and burned them when I was 7 years old. And what better place to begin the perfection of an outlaw than in a penitentiary? A place that was loaded with every anti-establishment outlaw imaginable.
during this time, he learned about a certain hierarchy that existed within the prison regarding the different types of criminals. For example, a thief was considered lower on the totem pole than someone who is a con man. He compared the two to blue collar and white collar workers.
But there was one kind of criminal who stood out to Charles that he felt was respected above all, something that he from then on aspired to be.
And that, dear listeners, was a pimp.
And that is where we will pick up next week for part 2 of our series on Charles Manson.
Yes, next week he's going to learn all sorts of lessons about women and manipulation, lessons that will eventually lead to the formation of the Manson family.
So, I think we can all agree, remarkably shitty childhood.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
But like we said before,
Not an excuse.
not a fucking excuse, because everyone still has choices to make.
Mhm.
It's pretty much, I think if you have any sympathy for him at this point, if you have any sort of feeling sorry for him, feelings in you, it's probably going to end about now.
Yeah.
That's
And-
about it.
And I have to say, if you do feel those feelings, that is fair.
Oh, valid.
I felt them too.
Absolutely,
I
yes.
was working on this and reading about him and reading all the stuff that he said in the book. And it's like, this is sad. This is very sad. It's a terrible existence that he had. He was abused. He did abuse back, but that is no excuse for what he's going to do later and for being responsible for the slaughtering of a lot of people.
There were a lot of turning points, like he says in this story, and he calls them turning points himself.
Yep.
But the thing is, with a turning point, you have 360 degrees to choose from.
Yes.
And each time he chose wrong.
Yeah. Every single time. Like, he was not capable of making good decisions.
No.
And
And
he had no one to guide him.
exactly. And the people that he did come across guided him in the wrong fucking direction.
Yes, exactly. And I want all of you to remember, things are going to get absolutely horrific. As of right now, the majority of the bad things that we've talked about have happened to Charles himself, but that's nothing compared to the pain that's going to be inflicted by the family in his name. Some of the subject matter today was certainly difficult, but I want to warn you all, it's going to get so much worse.
So much worse. But you guys have heard of Manson for the
Yeah.
most part.
Yeah.
You know what to expect.
Yeah.
Somewhat. There's a lot of information here, and like you said, a lot of really gnarly shit.
Mm-hmm.
I think your sympathy will run out very quickly.
It will. You're going to feel sorry for him, and you're going to have that moment where you're going to forget about everything we talked about, and you're going to be like, fuck this guy.
A lot of times when you've done the research and you've done the writing and I'm reading through the script, I kind of go into it like I'm reading a book for the first time that I've never heard before, even if I
Yes.
am somewhat or more or less familiar with the story like I am with this one. And you get into the writing and you get into the reading and all the knowledge. Sometimes I kind of forget whose story we're telling.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sort of getting into it like, oh my God, this is so interesting. And then you remember, oh, wait, I know the ending to this one.
It's funny that you say that, because one of the things that got me was thinking about the baby picture. The baby picture really got to me.
Yeah.
But I look at that baby picture, and then I look at that man with the crazy hair and the swastika carved into his forehead.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, oh, okay.
No baby left there.
No.
No innocence left
No,
there.
definitely not.
Alrighty, so we've got some thank yous to give.
Yes, we do. Those of you on Patreon, hopefully you're watching and you're seeing us right now.
Hello.
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 This is new. It's exciting. This is something we have been working towards since the start.
Yes, it's always been kind of a goal of ours to obviously improve every time. We've wanted to do video content for quite a while now, and a lot of you guys have been asking for it too. It seems like the magic puzzle piece that's kind of been missing a little bit. So we're going to see how it goes. I'm going to do my best with the editing.
You got this. I believe in you.
I guess we'll find out.
I guess we will.
But hopefully you guys enjoyed seeing our faces. Big shout out to everybody on Patreon. Y'all are fabulous. And yeah, so big shout out to our Grim VIPs.
Yeah, let's go.
At the end of every episode, of course, we love to give a shout out to our Grim VIPs. That is our $10 tier on Patreon. And since we've done a little bit of reconfiguring, that is the highest amount. Like Dina said in the beginning, you can subscribe to our Patreon for as little as $3 Canadian.
Yes.
Which is about the price of a double-double these days if you're a Timmy's fan.
Yeah.
It's not going to get you a Starbucks drink, but it'll get you a good old Tim Hortons.
It will.
But all that to say, a splendiferous thank you to our wonderful Grim VIPs.
We really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much to Lisa, Atlantean Jedi, Bob, Brian, Hillary, Judy, Kevinus, Musicus, and of course, Mayhem Mudkip. You guys are the bomb.com. We love ya.
The Titty City, the cat's pajamas, all the good stuff. And you are the delightful folks that get to see us in video. Well, I don't know if it's high definition. It's some kind of definition.
We're there.
But you're the first to see it,
Yeah.
so kudos to you.
Yeah. And also, if you want to enjoy the content along with us, we are always on YouTube at 12 p.m. MST every Saturday for the release of our latest and greatest episodes. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know how you wouldn't know, what the hell. We have a second show called The Grim Curriculum Extra Credit that is released every second Wednesday. We cover current events, strange history, a strange and unusual death, and a whole lot more. It's unscripted, it's chaotic, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of whatever we want to talk about, just kind of off the cuff, more of a candid conversation where we bring different topics to the table. And we are always on the hunt for new topics to talk about. So if you have an interesting case that's going on in the news you want us to take a look at, if you have some grim history or something funky that you want to introduce us to, we're always down for like new facts and new things. So by all means, send them our way. Grimcurriculum.com. No. thegrimcurriculum@gmail.com. You can email us there.
And send us some emails about your thoughts on the episodes that we cover, old and new, because I love hearing from you guys. I know Charlotte does too. It's always great to get a different opinion on the things that we cover. Apparently, our last episode, The Pied Piper, had some controversy in it that I have noticed on YouTube about the definition of a sprat.
Oh, I did not know that.
It's a fish.
A fish?
It's a sardine or something. I don't know. The YouTube comments have been blowing up about it being a kind of fish. There's different types of sprats. They are a small fish. I don't know. We don't know. But it kind of made me happy because I was like, we're at the point where we have enough listeners and enough people listening where they're listening and they're taking it in enough to tell us we're wrong.
Absolutely. I did ask my dad about it. He says sprats is still slang where he's from for potato.
Yeah.
But clearly, if it's a fish, I stand corrected also.
What's a sprat? I mean, really, you know what? It's that's some history for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always down to learn new wacky shit. There's so much crap floating around in my brain rent-free that now I'm going to be like, sprat, fish.
Yeah, sprat potato. Who knows?
Alrighty. Well, I think we'll call her good for the day. I don't think we have anything else to say to y'all while we're here. So, all that being said, thank you so much for listening. This has been
The Grim Curriculum. I have a fun fact.
Yes, you do.
It's short, but it's fun. It made me think. Okay, did you know that in the line of existence, the line of time, the T-Rex existed closer to us than it did to the Stegosaurus?
Oh, so you're telling me in Jurassic Park where there's like a Stegosaurus and a T-Rex and that never would have happened?
Shit didn't happen.
Fuck. Bye.
Bye.